This is The Hypothesis, the show where industry experts debate and discuss growth marketing approaches, digital advertising tactics, measurement plans, as well as creative and growth strategies.
I'm Eric Sloan, VP of Data and Strategy at Thrive Digital.
I'm Maddie or Madeline, and I'm an Associate Director of Strategy here at Thrive.
I'm your moderator, lay marketer, and asker of clarifying questions, Santana Blanchette. Hi, friends, and welcome back. We have got returning guest Maddie here. And today's hypothesis is all about everyone's favorite topic, which is money. So as we know, marketing teams do not have unlimited budgets, and so we need to spend our ad dollars wisely, or at least as wisely as possible for the most possible ROI. So this episode is one of a two-part series we're running on budget, and today we're talking about where you're wasting it, and the second episode will be on finding areas to cut if you have to cut spend. So today it is just about waste, and next time it's about necessity. So our official hypothesis today is that you're probably wasting some of your marketing budget. So let's start by defining waste.
When we've talked about in the past, we've kind of agreed that there's always some degree of waste in marketing. So it might be useful to differentiate legitimate wasted dollars where you did not want to spend that money versus dollars spent learning, where maybe the outcome was less profitable or efficient than you would have hoped, but there was still some value in spending that money because you learned something about your marketing program or your targeting. So I think we can maybe draw a line there between waste and dollar spent learning.
Yeah, because it's really important to call out that like not every impression in digital advertising needs to be doing some kind of heavy lifting, right? There's a certain amount of waste that exists just in the distribution of ads on the internet. There's a certain amount of bot traffic. There's a certain amount of wasted clicks. There's a certain amount of just sort of noise and waste in the system itself. And that's really not what we're talking about here. We're kind of trying to talk more about, we put in $10 and we got a certain amount out of that $10 in terms of marketing efficiency. Well, could we have spent $8 and gotten the same amount of marketing efficiency? Is there an actual action that we could have taken in order to reduce spend, but also get the same outcome? That's sort of how I see waste, especially in the context, as you say, Maddie, with testing. I would never classify that as waste. Yeah, like you're spending money and maybe you're not getting the return that you want, but you're actually learning something. And so the return is in the learnings and not necessarily in profitability or direct ROI.
Wasting a certain amount of money is inevitable. And I think we can all agree marketers do waste spend. And we don't necessarily need to put all the blame on marketers for that fact, because there are so many pitfalls and booby traps in the modern marketing environment. It's inevitable to avoid things like bot traffic, terrible placements, wasted spend because the platforms are really taking advantage of low incrementality audiences, etc. But I guess where we do want to take some accountability back is on the fact that budget management and decisions on how to divest marketing budgets is a strategic responsibility. And if marketers aren't managing their budgets with a critical mindset and a bit of caution, they're wasting spend out of negligence. And really that's what the environment, platforms and publishers are built to take advantage of.
The other piece of waste that I just wanted to call out too is something that I feel like digital marketers really get hung up on, targeting the right audience or trying to segment down to specific parts of the audience. I see a lot of digital marketers sort of looking at their Google Analytics and maybe trying to find segments of audiences that they can sort of layer into what their advertising targeting is and such. And the thing is, I go back to this point of every impression doesn't need to be actually doing work in order for you to be reducing waste. If you think about the analogy of a billboard or something like that, I mean, if you're reaching the right people that are driving past that billboard, it doesn't matter that a bunch of people are also driving past and not being affected by that advertisement or not paying attention to it, right? So I think that it's less about maybe serving to only the right people and only the right messages and trying to kind of polish the system to the point where there's no waste at all, and more about making the right investment decisions to drive the biggest impact and not going too far. Mm-hmm. When I say going too far, that's probably the most common piece of waste in digital advertising that I see is you take a channel, you whatever way that you're measuring it. Let's take branded search because it's actually a classic one. You see in your attribution report that there's this big return. It looks very profitable because the return on ad spend is very high. And so you say, oh, okay, we need to keep funding this. We need to push harder. How do we actually find ways to spend more in this channel? And I would say the ideal is to find ways to spend less and maintain the outcome from that particular channel. And that goes for a lot of different conversion-based advertising. So
let me see if I've got this correct then. Negligence and lack of due diligence is marketer waste. That's waste. And a swing and a miss, or testing something, or making an educated guess and getting it wrong, that is a learning. Is that where we're defining a learning versus waste?
I think the only way that you can avoid wasting spend is to be critically thoughtful. And so that's where I think we need to draw the line and say in some cases we are being misguided, as Eric put, where we double down too much in certain areas, or we are negligent in certain ways. But there is a lot of value in still making bets and making decisions on spending in different areas that doesn't necessarily need to be considered waste. I would really say that a lot of the waste is not so obvious necessarily, and that's really why it can be kind of nefarious or difficult to control, is that it's very incremental. It's happening all the time, all around us, and it's often just because we're not looking at the signals. We're looking at our one shiny number, or we're just looking to spend the budget, as opposed to what you said, Eric, how do we meet our goal while spending as little as possible? We're just looking to spend the budget, and that's where we fall into those traps.
I think negligence is quite a strong word. And certainly there's some waste in advertising that rises to the level of negligence, right? And we see that in a number of different channels. Actually, non-branded search can absolutely be a channel where companies and marketing teams are over-investing in that channel because it's easy to measure, and it's easy to sort of see the result of it in your attribution reports and so forth. And all sorts of additional questions, to Maddie's point, need to be asked critically about that portion of the marketing program. And when it rises to the level of negligence, that would be when you start inventing metrics to sort of justify the spend in a particular channel. And, that's kind of complete negligence, because now you're sort of making things up in order to justify that spend. But typically if a company is overspending 10 or 20% in a channel or something along those lines, that's just they've hit diminishing returns, and they haven't asked enough critical questions about that part of their program in order to sort of level that back.
Okay, I will revise, take out negligence and call it tacit complicity in distrustful systems or oversimplification of marketing goals.
Okay. So now that we've defined waste, then, sort of in a roundabout, nebulous sort of way, it also kind of seems like vibes, was it wasteful or was it a learning? Who knows? But
I actually want to be clear here. It is measurable, right? And so there's various different ways of measuring the waste. But the easiest way, especially for bottom of funnel advertising spend, is to very specifically measure at what point do you reach diminishing returns, and pushing a channel past that point is going to be waste, right? And so you're no longer spending in a profitable zone. So the pure definition of how wasteful that is kind of, to use your word, nebulous, right? Because different organizations are going to have different goals. And if one organization is going after pure profit and sustainability in their business model, that's going to be very different than one that's just going after a land grab and wanting to grow at all costs, right? If it's just get as many people who are in market to make a purchase as possible, then maybe your strategy is going to push way further past that point of diminishing returns. But if you're focused on profitability, you want to be a little bit lower on that curve, right? And so it is measurable, and I think that it's not as nebulous as we might be making it out to be.
It's always measurable if you have a target. If you're like, this is our profitability and you're not meeting it, it's always measurable.
Well, now we've got like a pinned down sort of definition. How and where are marketers wasting their marketing spend? We've kind of started to dip our toes into this a little bit, but let's get a little more practical in our examples.
One thing I was getting at before is that I don't think that we set our objectives strategically enough often. We often are really focused on spending the budget that we're given as marketers, as opposed to spending the budget as efficiently as possible and going for the main goal. That could really guide our actions in very unprofitable ways, where we need to spend the budget or we need to meet a blended program ROAS target by the end of the month. So we end up rallying up spend on retargeting, and a lot of that ends up going to waste because we weren't clear on the objective we were trying to meet. And we're kind of shortcutting to these simpler kind of objectives to be able to cross off our lists. So I think that's one way. I think another way is marketers get obsessed with the idea of having a single KPI that they can focus on, and they don't look at other signals. One of those signals being diminishing returns. I think that's a really difficult concept for marketers to grasp, which is, yes, if I push more budget into this channel, my ROAS might drop from a 5 to a 4, and that 4 return on ad spend is still profitable and it's still my best return on ad spend, so I should push there. But what about that specific incremental budget that you added to that channel, moving from that 5 ROAS to that 4 ROAS? That incremental lift could have actually been a 1 ROAS, and it's actually very, very unprofitable traffic that you didn't even want to dip into to begin with. And you could have taken that budget and put it elsewhere and maybe driven a 3 ROAS, but a 3 ROAS on that 20K could be far more profitable than a 1 ROAS on that 20K dipped into the first channel. I think that's a really difficult concept for people to wrap their heads around. But even beyond that, I think we get so obsessed with this idea of ROAS, and let me take it back to like the greedy platforms, that these platforms are built to take advantage of that. They're built to say, one-step campaign, input your ROAS, don't look at anything else, don't look under the hood. And then what happens is you might get your CPAs or CPCs up to like $100 if your CPA is $200. And on top of that, the users who are targeted might not be incremental to your business at all. So then you're overspending on click traffic, you're overspending on people who you shouldn't have even targeted to begin with, but it's okay because we met the ROAS goal in platform. That's all we need to do. And so I think that's another big trap that marketers fall into is, let's just stick to the number, let's just meet that number on paper, regardless of what else is happening.
What you're really talking about there is incentives, I guess, right? And so from the sort of executive team or even the marketing leadership at an organization, if they're really focused on measuring absolutely every portion of the advertising program and getting an ROI and like a really precise number to every single day and every single campaign and every single creative and all of those things, those incentives actually cause a race to the bottom. And that race to the bottom pushes all of those ad dollars into the bottom of funnel that is much easier to measure and is typically inflated from a perspective of attribution. So the attribution number that you read in your reports is actually higher than the true impact that was driven towards the business. And so in this race to the bottom, you end up overinvesting in bottom of funnel because you're trying to make the report positive. The sort of ROI number at the end of the month becomes the most important piece. And yes, I absolutely agree that ROI is important. We want to have a return, but if we're measuring and setting the wrong incentives and measuring incorrectly how these campaigns operate, then we just get this race to the bottom. And I think that creates a ton of waste.
Yeah.
The biggest thing is media mix that I've seen. Every single media mix that I've seen for a digital advertising program has some amount of waste that can be just solved relatively quickly by rebalancing where those investments are. Unfortunately, the attributed return from your Google Analytics or your advertising platform attribution reports, that may come down, but the actual impact to the business will be amplified. And so you're driving more long-term value. And so I think that that's probably the biggest source of waste is incentives in my eyes.
Yeah. And the confrontation of a measurement system that isn't built to answer the question of ROI. We're getting back into this being a big measurement problem, which is just that somewhere along the line, as we shifted into online digital marketing, being data driven became super, super important. And we got obsessed with this idea that we need to have a number, and that needs to come from somewhere. And we've been searching for different tools to give that number. And so often those tools are wrong and we become over reliant on those tools. So I think that is one of the big problems there.
There's probably another thing that we haven't touched on as well, and that is the actual signal that we're sort of choosing to be our kind of North Star, right? And so in a B2B case, if an organization is just going after MQLs, for example, or cost per lead, these types of metrics can really cause a ton of waste as well. And even though you're hitting the sort of target and you're bringing that cost per lead down or that cost per MQL down, and you're driving a certain MQL number that the exec team has determined by working backwards from, hey, this is our revenue goal, this is how many sales reps we have. Let's work our way backwards to find out how many MQLs we have to drive. Now CMO, go out and find us this number of MQLs. That process creates a ton of waste, because what it does is it just drives towards the lowest quality MQLs, the lowest quality leads. And the only signal that we're sending to advertising platforms to optimize around is, did someone convert? And that's not a good enough signal. What we really want to be driving towards is driving pipeline, driving high quality leads, and having some kind of indicator of down funnel revenue. And if we do that, then that also will reduce a ton of waste in that system.
Yeah, an example of that is like very often with e-commerce projects, we've seen that if we tell a platform to go after something like an add to cart, we might find trigger happy people who are going to add to cart like 100 times. And that might not be as effective a signal at signaling intent as something that might be a little bit higher up, like viewing multiple pages, product pages, or scrolling through reviews or product details. So I think that is the tricky part, again, navigating the ad landscape. What you put in, you get out, and you have to be aware that some of that is going to be garbage. So your signal better be strong, and you better have confidence that, there is going to be some waste within that. But overall, it is really predictive of what you care about.
What about the more like tactical stuff, like in display advertising, for example, like going after serving your ad in the right places, right? And so there's a lot of like fraud that happens in that industry. And so like how much of that would you say is sort of the waste that you see in the programs that you work on?
I think that's huge waste that we see a lot of the time when people aren't taking like a placement first strategy, which is honestly what certain platforms want to get us to avoid, particularly bottom of funnel platforms like Google, who say, it's not the placement, it's the signal, it's the person. And then you find that you've fallen into a hole of spammy sites, and the people that you were meant to be targeting weren't even able to view your ad. So I think that does happen a lot, and it is really important in display advertising to be like to have a placement inclusion list and to actually be inclusion, exclusion, and be really strategic around placement targeting, because that happens so often. And even using third-party tools to track bot activity to try to defend against that, because there is a ton of ad spend that goes into bot traffic and terrible sites, which is not only bad from a profitability perspective, if you're being charged on CPMs, it's also terrible from a brand safety perspective.
Yeah, I feel like the companies that are selling the ads are very focused on like, hey, just give us the keys and we'll find the right users, and it doesn't matter where the ad is actually displayed. But the problem with that is, we're continually moving as an industry towards less and less signal, and so I don't want to hand over the keys. I don't want the ad platform, who is also incentivized to mix in bad inventory in that in order to sell some of their unsold inventory and all of that. I don't want that company, who has all of the incentives to sell more ads and to sell that bad inventory, to have control over all of the people that are going to be served the ad, right? And so yeah, it's a tricky balance to have, and we want to have some constraints and some sort of guardrails for those ad platforms, even if we're doing sort of mass marketing, so to speak.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you're out of a job if you're giving all of the keys to the platforms and the publishers. It's just a huge waste of money. Yeah.
We like our jobs, damn it.
Yeah, and I just think, yeah, you're like, a good marketer is a distrustful one in the current environment that we're in.
Absolutely.
We should sell T-shirts of that.
Wait for the Hypothesis merch store that's coming in season 2, friends. So I guess we've already touched on this a bit, Maddie. You were talking about like third-party tools to detect bots and unsafe sites and things like that. But question number 3 for me then is, what kind of tools and processes are useful to reduce or identify waste and wasteful spending?
What I want to say first, because we've touched on the topic of measurement, analyzing diminishing returns, running lift experimentation. I guess we might not have touched on that super specifically, but talking about identifying wasted spend where we're positioned across different channels. And measurement is a big tool, first and foremost, to detecting where you might be over-indexing in spend and where you can pull back versus where you can scale up. So just doing geo-lift or conversion lift testing to understand the profitability of current channels, assessing diminishing returns based on literally just looking at the data month to month if you've seen varying spend investment, or actually attempting to curve that out. But outside of more sophisticated measurement approaches, which there are many and should be a cornerstone of any marketing strategy, I do want to stress that it is in the marketer's hands to be analytical and concerned with wasted spend. And there's so many ways about that. And it's just applying a bit of curiosity to what you're actually running. So for example, if you're running Performance Max, running a script to understand where the dollars are actually being spent inventory wise. Is it literally just a copy of your search campaigns and ruining all of your carefully planned budget and bid strategy, because whenever the search campaigns run out of spend, it just filters through PMAX and all of your brand just goes in there, like all your brand search spend. So, running scripts that are available, going through SQR and seeing where you're wasting spend, looking at audience overlaps, looking at, are you actually growing your incremental reach? Looking at your frequency, are you hitting people over 10 times? There are so many ways to just explore to see where things are strong and where they aren't. And it's a little bit different now because the platforms, as we've talked about, have switched to really be machine driven and optimized to that signal. So it's not just about looking at what doesn't meet our ROAS target, because nowadays it's you'll see your report and say, well, what didn't meet our ROAS target didn't actually get fed spend. There's still waste happening outside of that top line report that they'll give you. And you just need to be curious and dip in and ask questions of what is this thing that I'm actually doing? Where are these ads serving? Who are they serving to? What is this package campaign type that we're talking about here? All of these, I would just ask really critical questions. If we're serving retargeting ads, who are those going to? How are we targeting them in other ways across the marketing program? Not just advertising, but email and so on and so forth, to kind of build that perspective of where might we be in terms of numbers that you can pull, or more just a deeper sense of common sense. Where might we be wasting spend?
Yeah, one thing I remember from earlier in the conversation is what you were saying, Maddie, about marketing teams sort of having a budget number and spending towards that. The type of behavior that tends to create, or at least what I've seen quite a bit in my career, is that marketing teams will spend into a given channel and sort of set the budget as here's my monthly budget and let's divide it by 30. And let's set that as our daily budget. And the problem with that is you're not introducing enough variation in how much you're spending in all of your channels in order to better understand the dynamics of those channels. And so if I were to sort of summarize the easiest thing to do, and yes, you can go out and run geotests, you can run MMMs and try to understand saturation curves and all of these types of things. But something that you can do today, it doesn't cost you anything, and is really easy to implement, is just start changing the daily budget, right? And so if you have a big non-brand campaign or you have a big Facebook campaign and it's driving a bunch of conversions, cut the budget by 10%, wait a week and see if the actual volume of conversions changes at all, right? And so if you're past the point of diminishing returns, you might cut the budget by 10% and see conversions only come down by 1%, right? And so now you know that that last 10% of spend is only getting you 1% of the total conversion volume. And so maybe you actually want to take that 10% of spend and push it somewhere else. Maybe you want to push it to a more broad campaign where you can reach more people or something along those lines and drive different types of business goals with that. Maybe you can drop it another 10%. In fact, there's a number of bottom of funnel channels where I would suspect you can pull back by 10 or 20% and see no change whatsoever in terms of the attributed conversions there. So yes, absolutely. Try to find ways to understand the sort of incremental impact and like these more sort of sophisticated ways of understanding the media mix and where your investments are going, but also just play around with those daily budgets more often, because I really think that digital marketers can do that more and better understand and get a feel for which channels are driving the value and when.
One thing I would add to that is like to enable that budget flexibility to happen, you actually have to be empowered. And that might mean, internal conversations with, other departments if you're working in-house, or with your clients if you're working in agency, to enable that budget fluidity. I think a huge pitfall of marketing program is having these set budgets for these different channels without enabling that flexibility to say, we're going to push down 20% here this month and we're going to push up here, and kind of sticking to rigid set budgets that might have been built off of faulty reasoning or reporting. So definitely having those conversations is an important piece of that too.
Sorry, accounting teams, but you probably shouldn't be deciding the media mix.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the other thing, and I just want to make a quick point on like the top line budget. Even if you can't change that top line budget for a channel, you might be able to, for example, cut by 25% for the first 2 weeks and then increase by 25% for the last 2 weeks, right? And hopefully that doesn't impact your attribution reports too much, but that will help you to sort of better understand the dynamics of each of those channels without actually changing the top line for the month.
Always a scrappy way to test.
Yeah.
Sneaky back routes.
Yeah.
I think you've already answered this question, but I want to pose it to you in case there's anything else we haven't mentioned. But why would marketers be investing in areas if they're ineffectual? And I think we've already touched on improper incentives. We've talked about, restrictive budgets set by numbers people and not marketers. Is there anything else under like, why would marketers be investing in these ineffectual areas?
The big bad platforms.
It's hidden.
It's not easy necessarily. It's not always easy. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's less easy.
Yeah, not to go back to that diminishing returns point, but like diminishing returns really does hide it, right? And so you can have a channel. Let's say that you have a channel that's working brilliantly, at least in terms of attribution. Branded search is one of these things that makes an attribution report look very, very good, which means that a lot of organizations include it in their blended return on ad spend whenever they're reporting up on the results of their marketing program. But if you have a target of, let's say, 4-to-1 return or something like that from your performance program, you could be driving the same number of conversions as if you spent a little bit less, and you would just be getting 600% or 6-to-1 return on that same investment, right? You're actually getting the same amount of conversions. And so that's part of the waste that we're talking about when we're talking about diminishing returns. But that's completely hidden because you have this budget target and you have this ROI or this return on ad spend target as well. And so what a lot of teams end up doing is they just keep spending up until that return on ad spend target, or even worse, they give the target to an ad platform like Google Ads or Meta Ads, and that platform will just spend up to that amount, and it's completely hidden. You don't actually know that you could have saved some of those dollars and pushed them elsewhere in the program. There's not really an easy way to know. And so, yeah, being hidden is probably the thing that I see the most.
Yeah. One other thing I wanted to add, because we have focused a lot on bottom of funnel being like the big harbinger of waste, is just that it does happen all up and down the funnel, and the pitfalls are kind of the same. If you look at top of funnel, often there's a complete avoidance of ROAS versus bottom of funnel. There's a complete putting ROAS on the pedestal, a complete worship of ROAS. And so I think at the top of funnel, like there needs to be a big focus on what are the signals of success, and they can't just be a CPM. We have to be really, really clear on placements, audience, and again, having a measurement strategy in place. So I think wherever you're doing this, wherever you're spending, the pitfalls are going to be the same, and they're going to be around what signals are you leveraging? Are you leveraging enough signals? Are you being strategic and looking beyond your top line KPIs to the overall program ROI? ROI? Are you looking at the big picture, essentially?
Yeah. And what's interesting about that, and like you and I might actually disagree on this a little bit, I sort of feel like bottom of funnel is more about trying to reduce waste and like kind of spending as little as possible to get as much in return as you can, right? And so like you want to kind of almost like feather down that spend to see how little you can spend while maintaining the return out of your bottom of funnel. Whereas top of funnel to me is more about like amplifying impact, right? And so there's probably more waste that's inherent in the way that top of funnel campaigns are distributed and activated because you're marketing to a much larger audience, right? And so you're caring less about getting that sort of efficiency of every impression, but you're trying to amplify the impact of those campaigns against the business, right? And so absolutely
more positive waste, the learning kind.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. You learn more and you can sort of, I absolutely agree. CPM is a pretty terrible way to measure the performance of those campaigns. There are much other more effective ways of measuring those campaigns. But I would say that waste almost becomes this secondary priority for top of funnel, and amplifying the impact to me is the number one priority.
Oh, I think like maybe waste is less important than targeting. I think like because we know our targeting at bottom of funnel, but then there's waste within that versus at top of funnel. It's like we got to find the targeting, and there's going to be some waste in how broad the net we're casting is, but it's not necessarily that kind of waste where it's definitely a different kind of waste.
Yeah, and you know the number one way to sort of amplify the impact of bottom of funnel. And the reason why I say that amplifying the impact of bottom of funnel is not a priority is because the number one way to amplify that impact is to actually do better top of funnel.
Yeah.
Because that's going to have a larger impact on your bottom of funnel and actually make it more effective in the long run.
Bringing success to the bottom of funnel is achieved elsewhere.
Yep.
So I have a quick tangent before we get off into our last question, but I want to put on our tinfoil hats for a second here and ask you two then, if we think the platforms are a little bit untrustworthy, which we already knew, do we think that automating, like adding further automation is only going to accelerate that? Like, do marketers need to be more critical as it becomes more automated, do you think?
Yeah. I mean, simple answer, yes. Yeah, absolutely. We're just seeing more and more aggregated campaign types where the bad inventory gets mixed in and it gets packaged up as a pretty new thing that everyone should test. So yeah, I do think that as more and more automation becomes the standard, it already very much is, and more, modeled conversions become the standard, we have to rely more on analysis and measurement outside of what those platforms offer.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like the signal that you give that automated functionality, right? So like if you're running an automated campaign, you really have to think about the signal that you give it. And so if you're optimizing towards purchases, you're going to hit the point of diminishing returns relatively quickly because those automated campaigns, AI-based campaigns are just so good at finding the signal or the needle in the middle of the haystack. And all of those needles are the conversions. It will go and scoop them up. And then you're kind of left with everyone else who's not in market to buy today, right? And those campaigns or those campaign types are not great at going after brand type outcomes, right? And so I think limiting how much investment is in those automated campaigns is definitely something that marketers have to think a lot about now.
Especially because the conversion windows are so tiny that it's like that your definition of in market might be 30 to 60 days, but the conversion window is 7. And so who are we actually not only ignoring, but potentially optimizing against by focusing so much on signal optimization when it's, has to be so immediate.
Yeah, and even for those 7-day attribution windows, I would say that the signal quality falls off a cliff after 1 or 2 days too, right?
Oh yeah, it's like 70% 1-day view. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Does this answer our question prematurely by me saying, what do we think people will be wasting money on in the future? Is it just throwing money at platforms for them to do the work? Is that the answer to the next question?
I think, yes, it is throwing. I think, again, like we kind of decided that waste is inevitable and happening all around us. So it's going to continue. It was happening 10 years ago. It was happening 50 years ago. I mean, we're closer to what was happening 10 years ago than 50, of course. And now we're really in an automated digital world for advertising. So I think we're going to see more of the same for sure. We're also going to see a lot of spend waste in different tools and platforms that emerge to try to solve problems, as always happens. I don't think things are going to change. It's down to individuals and organizations to have a clear strategy around how to maximize profit for as little spend as possible.
I also think that LLMs are going to create a lot of waste in marketing.
Yeah.
Because marketers are going to be asking these LLMs, ChatGPT, Gemini, like a pick your flavor kind of thing. But they're going to be asking these LLMs for advice on how to build media mixes and those types of things, and you get generic feedback out of those types of questions, right? And to go back to the point made earlier about thinking critically about the tools that we use, we also have to think critically about the tools that we use to sort of help us to make decisions outside of the data and outside of the actual advertising platforms. And I think that with the increased use of these large language models and that type of thing for, as a sidekick for building marketing campaigns and building marketing programs, I think that that's actually going to create a lot of waste. And so I would say that is probably overly relied upon or overly trusted, I should say, maybe not overly relied upon, but overly trusted in the short term. They will most likely get better, and we see these cycles in the industry quite a bit. However, I think it's going to create a lot of waste in the short term because, if you give an LLM a bunch of data that is out of your attribution reports, it's just going to tell you to dump all your money into brand insertion retargeting.
So job safety. We've got job safety.
At least for now. Yes, hopefully.
Yeah, or it's just going to give you the most generic media plan you've ever heard of. And, someone who wants to get off work earlier is going to be like, cool, there you go. Let's do it.
I will say this. ChatGPT is not too bad. And maybe we should do an episode on this, like in terms of how it can help you build a marketing strategy and such. If you go back and forth with ChatGPT, you can really get somewhere a lot deeper and more sophisticated than the initial answer, right? And so one thing that I've heard a number of times is to sort of keep asking these large language models the same question like 4 or 5 times and go deeper and deeper and deeper. And then by the 4th or 5th time, you're really starting to get to something that is a bit more sophisticated and a bit more specific to your situation. So it really comes down to how that's used. I will say this though, there's no LLM that I've come across that has the sort of critical thinking sophistication in terms of like thinking about the dynamics of marketing, right? And so it can read data, it can give you a generic response that it has read on the internet and all of these things, but really understanding the dynamics of marketing, diminishing returns, advertising lag, like all of these things, I have yet to see sort of a effective outcome that factors all of those.
I would also say it's like the same way that I feel about photography, which is to say that like a really great photographer with an iPhone is going to do a much better job than I would do with the most expensive camera you've ever seen. You have to have the knowledge and the context and the insight and all of the right things to give to the LLM for it to even be a good strategic partner. Like you're already making so many assumptions about the user of it to get that strategy. I feel like we could get into this tangent.
We could go super far down this, yeah.
But this is where we're wasting time in this episode and where we think people will waste money in the future.
We have certainly passed diminishing returns on this episode.
Also, ChatGPT and all of that, I feel like we're pro all of that. Obviously, they're useful tools. I think it's just like, see it as what it is. It's a tool.
It's a tool. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
That's all. Okay, well, this has been a great episode. Look forward to the merch store. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. This has been The Hypothesis. Thank you so much for tuning in. For show notes or to get in touch, find us at thehypothesisshow.com or at Thrive Digital, both linked for you in our description box. And if you liked today's episode, we'd love if you'd rate and review wherever you're listening or watching. Thanks!